Alert! I host a brand new adult paranormal comedy talk show called Night Watchers. Go listen to the pilot episode on your favorite podcast app and give it a review on Apple and Spotify. That is, if you can handle stories about a man's wife having an affair with a demon and other goofy calls, with such guests like Niall from Oni Plays and possibly more in the future. That's Night Watchers. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Today's unsettling episode features allegedly true stories featuring a farm worker who's being stalked over the course of years by a tall, hairy creature that seems obsessed with him, and a Central American family dealing with a plot of land where a tall, pale creature seems to lurk, and more. Can you survive them all? Be sure to send us your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org so I can narrate them on this show. In just the last week, we've had 3 best of stories. Y'all are really nailing the submissions right now, and thank you for that. Also, be sure to follow and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Each follow and rating is kind of like rocket fuel, and if we get enough of it, we can finally blast off this planet and land on Mars. Thank you. Now, let's begin. Strange happenings in my family. From Finchii. I'm 20 years old, and I have diagnosed BPD with psychotic-like episodes. However, what I have experienced was not caused by these. The episodes I have experienced include auditory and visual hallucinations, but the visual ones last milliseconds. This is important to know. I'm also part Native American of the Seneca tribe on my dad's side. However, my father and I are so far removed, we cannot claim heritage, nor do we even look it. But I feel this is important to know for context. I live in western Pennsylvania, about an hour from the Pittsburgh area. I've lived in these parts my whole life, and I'll always call them home. To get the gist of the area, I live near the woods. However, the town is only just a few blocks away, and I'm surrounded by multiple houses. The woods are about 2 blocks away on the opposite side, and I've seen a wide array of animals: deer, raccoons, possums, even wild turkeys. There are also train tracks that go through these woods, where an old coal train passes through. It hasn't run much anymore, but you could feel it shake your house if you're close enough. Besides my own home, the rest of the town has a lot of history, including being a Native American trading post prior to the 1800s. It was also a place where many Revolutionary War and Civil War soldiers are buried, in the middle of town no less, where I was told many people see stuff. But that isn't the focus of this story. Now let me get into the first story that occurred around the time I was 12 or 13. I don't remember exactly what I was doing during this story, but I recall being in my living room. This is on the first floor looking out over my backyard. My mother was calling for me to head to bed, which I was on my way to do, as it was 11 p.m. However, I felt this urge to look outside, and what I saw sent me into a straight panic. My yard is pitch black, except for this small artificial pond we have, with a small light on it. When I looked out, I saw this shadow man walking across my yard. I knew it was a man. You could see the full shape, a tall, wide-shouldered man. This lasted only 1 second, and my mind began to race. I ran upstairs, breaking down crying into my mom's room. I was shaking so hard and could barely breathe, telling her there was someone in our yard. Things get foggy after this, but I think she had my dad go check. But no one was there. Days later, I thought about this and realized that none of it made sense. The way the man walked across my yard was no trick of the light. If it was, the shadow would face the other direction, but the light just lit it up. We also have a fence right next to this light, so the shadow should have appeared on the fence. I later brushed it off, but I did think about it a lot until then, as it would continue to scare me for some time. The second story. This one occurred around the time I was 14. Once again, it was late, but this time I was not alone. I was talking to some friends on Discord, laughing and having a good time. I told them the story about the Shadow Man, and they said I should go outside. Of course, I listened. I went, what the heck, why not, and went out into the backyard. I described some of my backyard in the first story, but I'll explain some more. My yard is almost a square shape with fencing on both the right and left. In the back, it's all trees with other houses behind ours, but you can see the woods just a few blocks away standing in the yard. When you look to the side in the back, there is a small path to go out onto the road. We also have this small shed in the corner of our yard. Also, as I've said, wild animals come through here a lot, so it's not impossible for anything to get back there. It was about 10 p.m. by then. We were still on the call, talking when I went outside. I had some earbuds in, but I turned the volume down quite a bit. I was hoping maybe I could hear owls that I've seen there in the past. I decided to walk off into the middle of the yard, as it would be easier to hear any sound surrounding me, and turned on my phone flashlight. I told my friends to quiet down so I could hear better. After a few seconds, I said, "Anyone out there?" Then we all laughed, knowing this would just be a way to get over my fear with everything I've encountered before. But I was wrong. When our laughter died down, we were just talking again, when I began to hear something that made the blood drain from my face. Toward the back of my shed, which was pitch black, I heard my name being called. Ryan. I froze. My friends were still laughing, but I pulled out my earbuds. I recognized that voice. It was my dad's voice. He was calling for me, but how was that possible? My dad was inside the house and asleep. The voice came from behind my shed directly, and I had that overwhelming feeling of dread, accompanied by a feeling of being watched. I felt myself starting to freeze and dissociate, but I snapped out of it, and instead of going to look, I ran back inside, deciding I'm not going to screw around with this horror film type stuff. I started to breathe heavily from the shock and fear of it, looking out the window of the door I'd slammed shut. My friends were confused, and I shouted how I heard my dad's voice, and they all went silent. I ran back up the steps so I wouldn't be near that yard at all. My friends had no idea what to say, and I didn't either. I didn't stop thinking about that all night, and it still lingers in my head to this day. I told my parents about this. They found it weird, but most likely believed it was just a part of my mental health problems. This experience shook me up so much, I stopped going into my backyard after dark. I would only go back out if perhaps my family was hanging around the fire pit. The third story is probably the most horrifying, next to the last one I experienced. I mentioned earlier how there are train tracks going into the woods. Well, during high school, I had this friend who wanted to take me on the tracks to show the hangout spot to me. In other words, where all the kids went to get on cloud 9. I wasn't the type to smoke or do anything like that, but I wanted to see it anyway. About 20 minutes of walking later, we got to the spot. There's graffiti everywhere, and we're in the middle of the woods, just the sounds of nature. We stayed there for a bit. I then decided to walk back after about 20 minutes. We were chatting and laughing about something when the sounds around us went dead. Not a bird chirping or a gust of wind to be heard. All of a sudden, a woman appeared in front of us. At least, I think it was a woman. She was somewhat hunched over, with clothes covering her head. I can only describe her as looking like she wore a babushka on her head, but covering almost all of it, since we couldn't see any face. My friend and I just paused. This woman was walking in front of us. We heard no noise of her showing up, Didn't even see where she had come from. She was about 10 feet away, back turned towards us, hobbling slowly forward. We looked at each other with a WTF expression, but decided to trail behind her. Never once did this woman turn around, say hello, anything. It was just pure silence. After a few minutes, we watched as the woman trailed off slowly. She walked off the tracks directly into the brush of grass and into the woods. We were freaked out, and I felt I was about to have one of my episodes, so we rushed back to town. We never spoke about it again, but I did tell the story to some of my family, and they were just glad I was safe. And I'm glad too. I will now move on to my family's accounts, which are strictly from my grandparents. For whatever reason, my mother and father have never experienced anything strange. My grandma on my mom's side is 83 years old and remembers this clearly from the 1970s. She lived in a town at the time where a massive Native American massacre occurred. This first story from her is when she was doing work outside, perhaps gardening or something else. There was this large hill nearby, and when she looked up at some point, she saw this gigantic bird. She thought it was a condor for a moment, and still believes it might have been. However, what would a condor be doing in western Pennsylvania? She described it as pitch black and flew up and over the hill, leaving her dumbfounded. When she told me this, I thought about the bird spirit of power and strength I've heard about many times, the Thunderbird. I showed her artwork depicting this spirit with its massive size, and she said it looked very similar. The other story my grandma recounted involved her once again, but also my grandpa and great-grandpa. She said back in the late 1970s, my great-grandpa and grandpa went out spotting for deer. If you don't know what that is, it just means one of them held a flashlight looking for deer, and once they found one, the other would shoot. Anyway, while they were doing this, they walked into a large field out in the woods. Very open, she said. What my grandpas saw seemed to have spooked them for the rest of their days. They described to her seeing this craft on the ground, with the lights around it. Not the traditional type of flying saucer, but more like a dome. They said they watched it fly off from the ground, making them run back home where they told my grandma. She told me my grandpa was usually full of himself. However, my great-grandpa, which was her father, was never a man to joke with, nor joke himself. She said they had the fear of God in their faces, and went silent for some time. Several days later, there was a knock at the door. 2 men in suits asked to speak to her dad and husband. She has no idea what happened after that, as they never told her, but we have the feeling they were noting their encounter somehow. I have no idea how they knew, my grandma said. My grandfathers died with the rest of the story in the early 2000s, before I was born, so only they will forever know what they saw that night. My final story comes from my other grandma on my dad's side. Much of this is paranormal accounts, which I saw some of. In 2023, my step-grandpa passed away from a heart attack, and his funeral was held days later. His birthday was at some point in July, where me, my grandma, aunt, older cousin, my mom, and dad went to celebrate at his grave. We put a can of beer down for him, since he loved having beer. We also had about 6 balloons out, and it was quite a windy day. After we sang happy birthday, we watched the beer can pop open, with some of the liquid fizzling out and dripping down into the dirt. We stared in shock, but not fear. It was kind of peaceful. The balloons then stopped still in the wind, like he was grabbing them. It was incredible to see, if I'm honest. Another time, when over at my grandma's house, a football game was on, where my dad and others were getting heated. There's this giant grandfather clock that doesn't work, but when something went bad in the game, the pendulum started to swing rapidly. That one went unnoticed by many except my grandma and I. It happened a few times though. I appreciate you taking the time to hear these stories. Keep your mind open, as there are strange things that occur all around us. You just have to pay attention. Christmas Visitor by MichelleMichelleMichelle. This happened around Christmas time a few years ago. I still remember it like it was yesterday. I don't have any sort of rational explanation for why it happened, and honestly, I've stopped trying to make sense of it. Some things just don't fit neatly into logic or reason. My grandmother, Gloria, passed away around Christmas many years ago. That detail will become important later, but even without it, she's someone I think about often, especially during the holidays. I miss her dearly. She was a warm, loving presence in our lives, and her absence is always felt more deeply when the lights go up and the snow starts to fall. I live with my mother in a major Canadian city. Because, well, rent prices are what they are in the big city. On weekends, we have a little tradition. We order takeout and watch cheesy TV movies together. It's our way of unwinding and spending time together, especially since we don't get much of it during the week. I work full-time, and by the time I get home most evenings, we're both too tired to do much more than exchange a few words, quickly scarf down some dinner, and collapse into bed. So weekends are special. This particular weekend, just before Christmas, it felt like any other. We ordered food and were waiting for it to arrive before starting a movie. We were both in good spirits, chatting about our weeks and laughing at the ridiculous synopsis for the movie we were about to watch. Not long after we placed our order, there was a knock at the door. That caught me off guard. It was way too soon for the delivery to have arrived. I was in another room preoccupied with something, so my mother went to answer it. I could hear her talk to someone, but I couldn't make out the words. A moment later, she closed the door and came back looking puzzled. I asked who it was, and she said it was a woman, someone we didn't know, asking if Gloria was here. We both froze. That's not a name you hear often anymore, and it's certainly not one associated with our address. We've lived here for a long time, decades, and no one named Gloria has ever lived here, even before we purchased the house. My grandmother never stayed with us, and none of her friends ever visited us at this address, nor would they even know where we lived. By that time, most of our close friends had either passed away or lost touch with the family. None of the neighbors on either side of our house are named Gloria. At the time this happened, the neighbors to the left of us were all guys, so there definitely wasn't anybody named Gloria over there. There's no logical reason why someone would come to our door asking for Gloria. The timing made it even stranger. As I mentioned, she passed away around Christmas, and when I texted my cousin to tell her what had happened, she reminded me, chills running down my spine, that it was that exact day, the anniversary of her passing. I don't know who that woman was. Maybe she had the wrong address, or maybe it was a coincidence. But I can't shake the feeling that it was something more. A gentle nudge from the universe, a reminder that our loved ones never truly leave us, that they find ways to say hello, even years after they're gone. I like to think it was my grandmother, stopping by to check in. Maybe she saw us laughing and enjoying our little tradition and wanted to be a part of it, just for a moment. Maybe she wanted to remind us that she's still with us, in spirit, if not in body. Stop by any time, Mimi. I miss you. The Black Kitten by JessieLG. My grandpa only told this story when it stormed. Not just a little rain either, I mean real storms. Thunder that shook the house and lightning that turned the living room white for half a second. Nights when the wind howled down the chimney and made the lights flicker like they were thinking about going out. That's when he'd say, "Go stoke the fire, moja Lyobov. I've got a story to tell you." It always started the same way. My mother, your great-grandmother, told it to me. Said it really happened to her father, back when he was a boy, right here in New England. Long before you were born, long before the world forgot how to look over its shoulder. He'd sip his tea, eyes on the flames. They had a cat, see? A beautiful old thing named MariKre. And one spring she had kittens. 5 of them. And one of them was black. Not dark gray or smoky, but solid black, like a shadow with teeth. And Babushka, my great-great-grandmother, she said that kitten was evil. He'd always look at me then, just to see if I was still listening. She wasn't wrong, he'd say, and then the story would begin. They lived in a blue house near the woods, in a quiet New England town that did not know how to pronounce their last name, Petrovsky, so most folks would refer to them as the Russians. It was a happy house for the most part. Misha, the father, taught math at the community college. His wife, Galina, baked bread that made neighbors linger at their mailbox longer than they had to. And their son, 10-year-old Alexei, with hair like black straw and a gap in his teeth, was the kind of boy who could talk to bugs without squashing them. And then there was MariKre, the fat, long-haired tabby who rolled the house with a yawn and a tail flick. She had been with them since Moscow, hidden in Galina's coat when they left everything behind. MariKre had outlived 2 apartments, a snowstorm that knocked out the town's power for 8 days, and the birth of little Alexei. So when MariKre grew round with kittens, it felt like a small miracle. They were born on a quiet Tuesday in April, under the radiator by the piano. 5 kittens, 4 striped and cream-colored, and one, last born, who was the color of spilled ink. Its fur drank light. Its eyes opened earlier than the others. The family adored the litter. Galina doted on them with saucers of milk. Misha built a little fort from cardboard and old towels. But Babushka, Misha's mother, only looked at the black one and crossed herself. "Chiotov Kotyanok," she muttered, shaking her head. "You keep that one. Bad things come. Just like with your uncle, just like before." They laughed. "Baba," Galina said, "it's a kitten, not a demon." But Babushka never looked in the eyes. Alexei picked the black kitten. Of course he did. He named it Nyx, after a goddess of night he'd read about. "Because she's brave," he said. "She's not afraid of anything." Babushka stopped sitting in the living room after that. She started keeping dried herbs in the pockets of her sweater. It started with small things. Alexei's hamster cage unlatched itself in the night. The hamster was never found. A neighbor's dog, a yappy Pomeranian that barked at wind, was found 2 days later with its neck broken, curled in the Petrovskys' driveway. No one could explain how it had gotten out. And Nyx, so tiny, so delicate, was always asleep during these events. "She's just a kitten," Galina would say, brushing her fingers over the soft, shadow-dark fur. "She couldn't hurt anything." But the lights in the hallway flickered when Nyx walked by. Alexei's nightmares returned. He dreamed of a tall thing with 2 long fingers sitting at the edge of his bed, whispering in a voice that sounded like wet leaves. Misha began to lose things. His glasses, his keys, his temper. Babushka stopped laughing. She burned sage in the garage and painted old symbols on the door frames. "Too late," she muttered. "Should have drowned it." One night, Alexei woke up screaming. When they ran into his room, he was curled up in the corner, bleeding from scratches across his chest. "She was on me," he cried. Her mouth opened too wide." They turned, expecting to see Nyx. She was sitting on the windowsill, tail flicking, eyes wide and empty, watching. Misha said it was time. They wrapped Nix in a towel. Galina cried. Alexei wouldn't look. They told themselves she'd go to a farm or a shelter, someplace kind. But Babushka said, "No, there is only one way." They followed her deep into the woods behind their house to an old ring of stones, older than the town and older than memory. "I knew it when I saw her," Babushka said. "She's not a cat. She's a vessel. She wears a cat's face, but what's inside is older, hungrier." They left her there, in that stone ring. Babushka murmured a prayer with words no one else understood. The wind screamed once, and then it went still. They walked home without speaking. Mirka never had kittens again, and Alexei stopped having nightmares. But sometimes when the wind is strong and the moon is full, the lights in the Petrovsky house flicker, and Galina swears she hears purring just beneath the sound of the wind. Once, a year later, Alexei found a tiny paw print on the inside of his bedroom window. From the outside, the glass was clean. That would be the end of my grandpa's story. But just before he got up and went to bed, he would say, "Sleep tight, little one, and don't let the black kittens in. They don't always leave." The Cold Room by MariKre. It happened about 15 years ago. I had just moved out of my parents' home and was living with my boyfriend, now husband, in a 2-room apartment that belonged to his uncle. His uncle had this habit of buying cheap old flats, fixing them up, and then renting them out. Nothing crazy, just Soviet-era apartment blocks, like the ones you still see all over Eastern Europe. Our flat was on the 5th floor of one of those old panel buildings. It had a big living room with a door that led directly into the bedroom. We moved in at the end of summer. It was still warm outside. Too warm even, especially up there on the top floor. The sun would bake the roof all day, and by evening, the whole flat would feel like an oven. Except for the bedroom. The bedroom was always ice cold. At first, we loved it. It would feel like a relief after the heat of the day. But over time, it started to feel wrong. Like, why was it so cold all the time? I had a cat back then. I'd raised her from a kitten, and by the time we moved in, she was already 8. She'd always been incredibly loyal. She slept beside me every single night. But soon after we settled in, she started to act strange. There were days when she refused to come into the bedroom, or she'd be lying on the bed during the day and then suddenly bolt, her back arched, tail puffed up, hissing and growling like something had scared her half to death. At first, I thought it was just her age. Maybe she was having bad dreams, waking up disoriented and panicked. But then I started to notice how she would just sit in the driveway, staring into the bedroom. She'd be alert and tense. Sometimes she'd growl, like warning something that I couldn't see. And more, she would stay out of the room altogether. One afternoon, I was sitting at the desk in the living room, typing. It was quiet. The bedroom door was open to my right, and I knew my cat was sleeping there. I'd seen her earlier when I came from the kitchen. Then, all of a sudden, there was a loud thump, like something heavy had dropped, and a sharp yowl, the kind of sound a cat makes when it gets hurt. I stopped typing immediately and turned my head toward the bedroom. But I didn't see anything out of the ordinary, just the bed. A second later, my cat shot out from under it, sprinting full speed across the room and straight into the kitchen. She didn't stop, didn't look back, just ran like something had terrified her, and maybe even hurt her. That was probably the first time I seriously started to wonder if there was something wrong with that apartment. Then one night I woke up to the sound of her growling. low and guttural, a sound I had never heard from her before. I looked toward the door. She was sitting there right in the doorway, staring straight at our bed. My eyes followed her gaze. At the foot of our bed, there was a figure, a tall, dark figure. It was just standing there and watching me. One hand gripped the metal frame of my bed. I don't know what it was. I couldn't see a face. It looked like it was wearing some kind of long, dark cloak that covered everything, but there was enough light coming from the window to make out its shape clearly. And that hand, I still get chills from that memory. I didn't scream or move. I simply whimpered and pulled the blanket over my head like a child. I squeezed my eyes shut and begged silently for it to go away. I heard my cat growl again, then hiss, angry and scared, and then she ran off. After that, there was silence. Then, after what felt like forever, I heard the soft sound of paws on the floor, that familiar little tapping of her sweaty pads. She jumped softly onto the bed and curled up next to me like she always used to. Only then did I dare to pull the blanket down and peek out again. That was the only time I ever saw the figure. But my cat never stopped being wary of that room. She would still sit in the doorway, staring into the room. And after that night, she began circling the bed, as if something was now hiding underneath it. That room always stayed colder than the rest of the apartment, no matter what we did. 9 months later, we moved out. In our new place, my cat never acted like that. No more growling at empty doorways and no more fleeing from things we couldn't see. At night, she slept peacefully beside me, calm and relaxed, just like she used to. And during the day, she would nap alone in our bedroom without a care in the world. So whatever it was, I think it stayed behind. Cryptids and the Paranormal in Central America by CuriousM. I really don't know where to start with this. I guess a hello is in order, and you can call me M. I have many stories of the paranormal and cryptids from my home country, El Salvador, in Central America. Stories that have been told by my family and experiences of my own. I'll be sharing some of those with you, and if you want more, I'll happily share. These are all true accounts. I will tell them as best as I can recall. Today, I'll be sharing some of my uncle's stories. I'll call him T. T is one of my many uncles. He has always been a hard man who worked the land in my country his whole life. He's about 6'2", maybe taller, so he's not easily intimidated. After some time, he bought a big plot of land somewhere far from the rest of the family. But we still visited from time to time. His home was a bit secluded. The nearest neighbor was probably half a mile or more away. His house was next to the main and only road. His land behind the house stretched far and wide. It almost seemed like it didn't end. The road was just dirt and rocks, the typical roads in the middle of nowhere. He raised and sold cattle there, so you'd see them in the distance if you passed by or visited. His house and land was fenced up by barbed wire. The entrance to the plot where the cattle were was a simple V-shaped wooden gate, so to say. No door, just a narrow V-shape to prevent anyone but a human to go through. There was also another gate nearby to bring animals in and out, but was always kept locked. The plot was surrounded by dense trees and brush, but his plot was bare and clean with a few trees here and there. So on to the first experience he had in that house. He told us this story when we visited around 2012. He said one night he woke up in the morning. Can't remember the specific time, but definitely the middle of the night. He felt like he needed to pee, so he stepped out onto his front porch. You could see the road leading to the house and the surrounding area if you were standing there. The road was about 50 to 100 feet away from the porch. There was a wooden gate that you could close between the house and the road, but he usually kept it open. The road on his side was fenced by barbed wire and a rock wall on the other side. The road came down a small hill on the left, a winding small curve, and kept going straight down to the right onto another curve. He said the moonlight was bright that night, so he could easily see the area. He decided to relieve himself right outside the porch, as the bathroom was a ways away from the house. For some background, a lot of homes in Central America are set up that way. There is no sewage, so they just dig a huge hole in the ground somewhere near homes and make a makeshift restroom on top, which is why they're not inside. Many homes were made this way, even ours. Anyway, he said as he stood there doing his business, he caught something moving to his left. When he looked, he couldn't believe it. Walking down the road, he saw this tall, skinny, pale white, nude, humanoid-looking thing. He said it walked weird. Its movements were not normal. It looked a bit slouched as it walked, with those long arms hanging down its sides, but they were stiff and didn't move or sway with every step. It almost looked like an ape or a penguin waddling, if that makes sense. He stood frozen, just looking at this thing slowly make its way down the road. When it was in front of the house, it suddenly stopped. Then it slowly tilted its head and looked right at him. Its eyes were wide open like someone with no eyelids, almost like its eyes were going to pop right out. It had human eyes, no expression on its face. It looked human, but at the same time it didn't. It just stared at him, unmoving, for what felt like an eternity. He didn't know what to do. He snapped out of it and decided to slowly walk backwards into the house, but keeping this thing in his sight. He slowly made his way back in, carefully thinking out every step, and he quickly made sure every door and window was locked. He didn't dare to look outside again to see if it was gone. He never knew what it was, and neither did anyone. However, after hearing many stories of cryptids here, I'm leaning towards a pale crawler of some type. What do you guys think? Now on to the second story. This one is at the same property, but it happened to his wife, my aunt. We'll call her S. I heard this story from my mom because my aunt refused to ever talk about what happened that day, except to my grandma and mom, and obviously my uncle. My mom said that one day, S was home alone with the kids. For one reason or another, she went out to the side of the house. That side of the house had a small hill next to it that goes up to about halfway or more above the house, and then it's fenced up. The restroom I mentioned earlier sat at the other end of that hill. After the fence, it's just trees and brush. When she was there, something happened. I was never told what, and I don't even think she told my mom or grandma. All we know is it shook her to her core. When I saw her talking to my mom and grandma about it, she was crying uncontrollably, like someone who had seen the devil himself. I always wanted to ask her about it, and maybe I will now that I'm older, and it's been so long. I've always been curious as to what she saw, but no one knows. I'll poke around and see if I can find more info. But on to the last story I have of that place. This one happened when I was there. In 2012, our family decided to do what we call a molienda. It's a tradition where they grind up sugar canes in this huge contraption that is turned by bulls. After grinding the canes, they stir the juice from them in these big hot pots over fire and end up making candy. Well, it's like candy, but not exactly. These things usually lasted all day into the night. I was 12 years old at the time, with my cousins all around the same age. We loved these get-togethers. We got to hang out and mess around. It was also one of the only times we got to all be together in the same place. Everything was going smoothly until nightfall. It was around 8 or 9 p.m. The sun had already set. The plot behind the house that I told you about earlier was now pitch black. Nothing but darkness in that direction. We were hanging around with my cousins when suddenly our moms told us all to come near the house or inside. We weren't sure why, so we asked. All my mom would say was that my uncles had spotted red, glowing eyes coming from the fields where the cattle were, just outside the reach of the light. The eyes were near the house, close to the fences, not too far away, and they were staring in our direction. It may have been 1 or 2 sets of eyes. They were low to the ground, hiding behind the tallish grass. My uncle, accompanied by my other uncles, maybe 5 or more in total, went inside to get flashlights and guns. We sat quietly near the house, observing. The adults went out and searched the area, but the eyes were gone. They didn't find anything. No footprints either. After this, they decided to call it a night, and we went back home. The car ride leading out of the farm through the pitch-black woods felt eerie. It's an experience I'll never forget. That's pretty much the end of the stories of that place. Sometime later, my uncle sold it to one of my other uncles, who renovated it. He hasn't lived there though, just owns it. Maybe one day we'll go back and visit. For now, it's abandoned. My wife has always enjoyed the paranormal stories I've shared from my family, and she encouraged me to share them here. Let me know if you'd like to hear more. Encountering Bigfoot. From Snail Sucker. These events took place about 10 years ago. For a backstory, I'm a farmer in northeastern Montana, pretty much the middle of nowhere. My family always farmed in this area. Back before I was born, my dad and grandpa ran cows, but I couldn't take part of it because I wasn't alive yet. We had a lot of hay ground that never was put to use after they quit. So when I was around 15, I started haying in the summer. I didn't make big round bales. I put up what is known as idiot cubes, just smaller square bales that people can carry around by hand. I would sell them just to make a little bit of money over the summer. In mid-July, I had about 1,000 bales laying out on a hill that wasn't suitable for farming, but grew a good grass and alfalfa crop. It overlooks a flat plain to the west, and a slough or small pond surrounded by cottonwood trees to the east. The cottonwood patch is probably only about 100 yards across, but there's also a stretch of pasture that is pretty dense to the west of them. Bushes and shrubs cover about a 200-acre plot of land. Trees are scattered in throughout it. To the south of the hill and trees, there's a creek that has trees scattered all the way along it. Trying to avoid losing quality in the hay by letting it get rained on, I'd spend many late summer nights loading hay on trailers by hand and stacking them in piles and tarping them. This is where my first encounter happened. I had some football buddies helping me lug these 70-pound bales onto a trailer so we could get them covered before they got rained on. It was probably around 1 a.m. I had the pickup lights on and flashlights shining back at the trailer so we could see while loading. The headlights were pointed down into the cottonwoods, and we were standing behind the pickup. One of my buddies pointed out a pair of yellow eyes reflecting back at us. We didn't really have predatory animals other than maybe a mountain lion, but that was extremely rare. We sat and watched them for a while, just wanting to find out what it was. But they soon disappeared. We carried on with what we were doing. About 15 minutes later, we noticed them again, but in a spot a little bit north of where they had originally been. They went away again. I used a flashlight and started to walk down the hill just because of my own curiosity. I couldn't see anything, but as soon as I got within 25 yards or so of the trees, something went crashing through the water away from me. It was something large, so I got a little bit creeped out and thought maybe it was a moose, and that can be dangerous. I hightailed it back up the hill to the pickup and my buddies. They made fun of me for being so scared. It wasn't 10 minutes later the eyes came back, in the same spot. Now we were all getting creeped out, because that started to seem abnormal for any animals that live around here. We watched the eyes for what must have been about 5 minutes before they just disappeared again. I often carried a rifle in my pickup for shooting gophers. It was a .22 with a scope on it. I rested the gun on my mirror and looked down into the cottonwoods with the headlights pointing down at them. For a while I didn't see anything, but the eyes, sure enough, came back. They were in a different spot this time. I couldn't see what it was too well, but there was a human-shaped figure there. I could see no detail, and I let my friends look, and they agreed. That creeped all of us out pretty bad. But I was also mad that someone would be trespassing and watching a bunch of high school boys work. I took my rifle, and we walked on down to go and see what was wrong with the guy, and why he'd been watching us. As soon as we started down, the eyes went away. We went and looked around and never found a thing. It was so creepy. But we finished the field and called it a night. I told my parents, and none of us knew what to make of it. About a week later, I was up on the hill again alone, loading bales from the stack on the north end of the hill on a trailer. Early the next morning, I had to bring a load to someone who wanted to buy them. The pickup had its lights on, and I was on the trailer stacking, looking above the pickup and out into the area lit up by the headlights. I saw this silhouette crouching down just at the edge of the light. It was about halfway up the hill. I wasn't afraid yet, but I didn't want to be outside anymore, so I climbed in the pickup. The figure had that same yellow eye shine. I put the pickup in drive and started down the hill towards it. But then it stood up, and it was huge, probably around 7 feet tall. It wasn't doing anything. Now it was just standing and watching me. I didn't feel like waiting around. I spun around so fast, I knocked the bales off the trailer and went home. I told my parents the next morning, and I wasn't quite sure if they thought I was on drugs or just making it up. I went on with my work around the place, but I was always watching behind my back, and I made sure to limit my time being up there after dark. I didn't see it again that summer, but I wasn't up there again for a while after I got all the bales off the hill. The next spring, I was up there cutting hay. I was in a 4440 John Deere, which is a decently sizable tractor. The sun had already set and I had my lights on, but the sky was still a little bit lit up from the sun. It was probably around 9:30 to 10 p.m. in early July. Even a year after the previous events, I was creeped out. Suddenly, a rock flew up from the trees and hit the side of the hood on my tractor. I was terrified. It wasn't a big rock, but there was only one logical way it had come from those trees. I kept cutting, and I made a lap around the field, and another rock hit the tractor. By that point, I was done doing my cutting. By the time I made it back to the pickup, the last little bit of sunlight was gone, and it was totally dark out. I cut the lights off on the tractor. Then I ran and hopped in the pickup. The tractor was probably 30 feet away. I turned the key and the lights came on. The lights hit the tractor, and I almost lost it at what I saw. It was standing right behind the rear tire of my tractor, in front of the mower. It was on the other side of the hitch from me. Its right hand was resting on the fender of the tractor. It was the same size or taller than the cab of the tractor. It had knotted or shaggy dark black hair covering its whole body, except for the palms of its hands and face. Its hair looked like it was in dreadlocks. I could tell it was a male, if you know what that means. His face was scrunched up and teeth were showing. They weren't like a human's teeth. They were all yellowed and messy, and he had large, sharp incisors. His head was tall, or his face was moved lower than ours. He wasn't overly muscular like I've heard of in similar sightings. You could see the muscular detail in him, though. His left arm was hanging to just above his knee. I tore out of there as fast as I could. I don't think I slept at all that night. When I was climbing out of that tractor, it had to have been close enough to grab me, and I didn't even realize it. I didn't say anything to my parents, but I probably looked awful that morning. I was always an early riser, but I don't think I worked up courage to go back out to the tractor until noon. I cut that field and baled it all in daylight. I never went back up there to work unless it was broad daylight. When I was done, I was relieved to be out of there for the next year. This leads me to my last and most terrifying encounter with it. West of the thicket of bushes and the cottonwood patch, we have a field that's about 30 acres. I went over there alone that fall to disc it up. It was another late night. I had been working since 6 a.m. It was probably about 9 p.m. when I got to the field. The days were getting shorter, so it was just about dark out. I started on the boundary of the field. I was disking along the barbed wire fence that separated the field and the thicket. I noticed a disc fell off, so I got out and I started to walk back behind the tractor to find it. I got about 50 yards away, and I happened to look behind me. Back by the tractor, right off the side by the door. It was there, standing. I froze up. I watched it for maybe 30 seconds. It looked like it was searching. It crouched and looked under the tractor, up in the cab, in front, and around to the other side. And I realized it was looking for me. I took off running as fast as I could away from the tractor and towards the approach I came in on and the road. In all honesty, I had no idea what I was going to do. I got to the road and hid on the other side of the road in the ditch. I then called my dad to come and get me as fast as he could. He got there in about 5 minutes. When he found me, he asked what was wrong, and I told him. I doubt he believed me, but he saw how absolutely terrified I was. He drove us back over to the tractor, and that thing wasn't there. But in the soft, freshly tilled dirt, there were footprints. There was a large handprint in the dust on the hood of the tractor. Both were way too large. While we were out looking, I heard a half growl, half scream coming from the thicket. It was an absolutely horrific noise. It was deep and groaning, and then it went up to a sharp, yipping sound. We left the tractor and didn't go back until the next morning. Me and my dad don't talk about that event. Those are the most terrifying things I've ever experienced in my life. It was looking for me, and I have no idea why. I don't know if it was passing through or why it was always in those trees. Our land doesn't seem like it could sustain an animal of that size. But I don't work late anymore, and I always watch the tree lines. The Wendigo in my backyard. From Anonymous. I am from St. Louis, Missouri, but for the sake of this story, I won't use my real name. I've heard of Wendigos, skinwalkers, werewolves, all that stuff. I'm a paranormal freak myself, but this experience happened on my 25th birthday. It started as a normal day. I was getting the house set up for a party. Not a lot of people were going to come, not that I minded. My parents went to get my grandma that lived 45 minutes away from our house, so it would take at least an hour and a half for them to get back. My sister and I were in the living room hanging up the happy birthday poster, since it was a has-been hotel theme party. I think it was about 10 in the morning, wasn't sure. I wasn't paying much attention, but I heard this scratching sound suddenly from outside. I only thought of it as the wind or just deer roaming around, since we have a lot of deer passing through the neighborhood. Fast forward to the party. My uncle and my aunts plus my cousin showed up, and we were at the table eating and talking. It was getting dark by then, and my grandma was napping on the couch in the family room, while my parents and uncle and aunt went into the living room to talk. As for me, I was downstairs in the basement with my cousin, and just talking about anything. But that's when we heard it. It was low at first, the scratching sound that I'd heard earlier before the party. My cousin asked, "Dude, what is that?" I simply replied, "Just the wind or some animal, I don't know." But the scratching sound got louder and louder, and we kept listening to it, wondering what it was. Now, I know the sliding glass door was nearby and the curtains were closed, but I could hear the scratching sound just right outside the door. I looked at my cousin and I made up my mind. I slowly got up and I made my way towards that curtain. My thought was to peek to see what was outside, hoping it was just a deer or just the wind. My cousin was on edge though, sitting on the couch away from the door. I pulled the curtain back slightly, enough to see outside, and all I saw was a pair of eyes. I'm not sure because it was so dark out, but I definitely could make that out. This creature was about 7 or 8 feet tall. I heard my cousin almost scream but covered her mouth, and I couldn't move. But the thing snapped its head and looked right in my direction. I'm not sure how long it was until the thing tapped on the glass door, then in a flash, it was gone. I looked over at my cousin, and she was pale, probably the same as I was after seeing that. "What was that?" she asked. I shook my head. "No idea. It wasn't a deer." My cousin went home with my uncle and aunt after that. But for me, I checked outside every now and then. My parents were already in bed and my sister was in her room at the moment. I brought my phone with me and used the flashlight function. And for some reason I thought it would be a good idea for me to go out onto the deck, just outside the kitchen. Boy, was I going to regret that. Once I stepped foot outside, I could smell something rotten immediately, like a dead animal or something. I shone my phone in the direction where I could smell that rotten meat. Now, for a note, my deck has stairs that led down to the lower part of the backyard, where my dad normally grills and where our trampoline is. But there's a fence around it gated off, since there's little kids in our neighborhood. I looked over the railing nearest to where I can see the gate, and there I saw it again. The thing. I'm not sure what it was doing, but it looked up at me, and I heard a voice say, "Come here, hungry." I froze, but I knew if it was fast, it could easily come up the stairs. So I made a break for it, heading towards the kitchen, locking the sliding glass door and closing all the curtains while making sure the windows were locked completely. I then heard this sort of howl before everything went silent. I'm not sure if it ran off through the backyard or cut through the neighbors' yards, but I think it was gone. My cousin called me the next day. Together, we wanted to try to figure out what it was. At this point, I think it was a Wendigo. But I'm not sure if there's supposed to be Wendigos in Missouri. Then again, I could be wrong about that. But to think, there might have been a Wendigo lurking in my backyard. Well, I don't usually get Wendigos in my backyard. True story though, I get freeloading deer. There's this big fat doe and I know it's the same doe and it just lays in my front yard, not 5 feet from me when I leave the house and watches me leave. And by the time I come back from getting Starbucks coffee or something, 20 minutes later, it's still right there. I think it thinks it owns the place. But she's cute, so I'll allow it. Good night. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Unexplained Encounters. I've been your host, Darkness Prevails, and you can follow me on X at Dark Prevails. Leave Unexplained Encounters a rating and follow on Spotify and Apple Podcasts if you haven't already. And send us your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. By the way, if you want to catch my new adult paranormal talk show, you should look up Night Watchers on your favorite podcast app. And I would absolutely sprout fur if you guys would leave that show a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. That's Night Watchers. Thank you. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.